Howdy, howdy, friends and neighbors. This is your old pal B coming to you from the far side with that dash of Indo-Tex flavor. Selamat datang di Radio Farside langsung dari hutan. Welcome to another thought-provoking installment of Radio Farside. Why is humanity obsessed with the number 3? Where does the concept of Trinity come from? How did the universe begin? And what does it all have to do with banking? Stay tuned. A few housekeeping notes. You can find us at Radio Farside on Twitter, Radio Farside on YouTube and Facebook, and augenguy.com for the blog site and other goodies. The Farside store will launch soon with the finest arts and handcrafts from Java, including wayang, batik tulis, wood carving, brass, monel, angklung, chongklak, and fine arts selected by our award-winning curator. If you appreciate quality and uniqueness, then you will want to shop with us. In this installment of Radio Farside, we talk with the incomparable Joseph P. Farrell, Oxford Doctor of Patristics, and one of the leading writers and researchers in alternative history and science. Dr. Farrell joins us from his home in South Dakota, USA, to discuss his concept of the topological metaphor and his profound influence on the development of civilizations past and present. Please join us in welcoming our guest, Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. Joseph, welcome back to Radio Farside. It's really great to talk to you again.
Thank you for having me back, Bernard.
Well, the last time we spoke was with Scott DeHart as well, and we talked about transhumanism, and that interview turned out to be one of the most popular we've ever done here.
Oh, wow.
It's gotten, I think close to 2,000 hits just on YouTube and then Vimeo and the website as well, so people are very interested in what you have to say, I think. And that shows, too, in your popularity, which continues to grow across the world, from what I can tell.
Well, I hope so. I could use the royalties on book sales.
Yeah. Well, understood. Well, for this interview, what I was thinking of doing is launching with a concept that I've picked up out of your writings. It seems to be kind of a string that ties everything together, and it's something you call the topological metaphor. Right. And I relate that to similar concepts of Trinity and Richard Casares' triptychs and this whole idea of threes. And I wanted to take off with a little anecdote from my days as a Benedictine monk. I had grappled with how to understand the idea of Trinity, of three co-equal beings or entities that were both separate and completely one.
Right.
And one day I was picking up eggs out of the hen house, and I had this flash. And I ran down to the abbot's cell, and I said, Abbot, I think I understand the Trinity now. I said, the Father is the mind, the Son is the body, and the Spirit is the soul, and they're separate entities, but they all exist in one being. And he smiled at me, and he said, yes, you're absolutely right, but that's a heresy.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that kind of analogy, because that, of course, comes more or less directly from St. Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo, who came up with what are called in theological parlance the psychological analogies of the Trinity, in which the faculties of the soul, mind, memory, and will, or in some cases emotion or what have you, are analogs of the three persons of the Trinity. It's interesting that the Western theology, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, and so on, are very Augustinian in that sense, in that if one says the terms analogies of the Trinity, one tends to think almost as a kind of subconscious cultural reflex that the analogies are psychological.
Right.
But if you turn to Eastern Orthodoxy, which is very much the tradition that I come from, and that I would identify with if I were back in my ecclesiastical days, Within Orthodoxy, the Cappadocian Fathers, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, or sometimes he's called St. Gregory the Divine or St. Gregory the Theologian,
Right.
and then St. Gregory of Nyssa. When you look at those three persons, they come up with a very different type of analogy, and for want of a better expression, it would be called the sociological analogy. In other words, if you're going to think of God as three persons united totally and indivisibly in one nature, then humanity itself becomes an analogy of God, because every human being shares a common nature, a common soul, certain faculties that are all in common, and yet each individual person is an absolutely irreducibly unique instantiation of that. Mm-hmm. So they have you look not within, but rather outside of yourself in order to perceive the analogy. So there's two very, very different approaches. And of course, like all analogies, they ultimately break down.
Right.
But
well, and also I've gathered, at least in the Western Christian tradition, starting about 300 A.D., there seems to be a move of externalizing God and making humans as some kind of inferior thing that can never achieve the divine without some kind of grace.
Yeah, without grace, but it's actually again not strictly speaking true, because if you look at the liturgical texts, the old Latin Mass, and then of course the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom in the Eastern Church, it's very, very clear that as far as the ancient Catholic patristic tradition was concerned, you had the idea of salvation precisely as deification. In other words, you partook of, through Christ, you partook of all of the divine operations. You partook of immortality. You partook of, to a certain extent, a limitless growth in grace, and so on and so forth. So it was viewed not so much as a salvation from sin, but rather a salvation to becoming divine. So that's, these texts are clearly there in the old rituals, both East and West, and they're still there. They're still present to a great extent within the Eastern Church.
Well, especially in the creeds, I think, yeah.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, coming back around to the topological metaphor, this has been a really intriguing idea that I've gotten from your writings. First of all, topology is describing the surface of something, the tensions or the slack on it. It's a mathematical process. And then making it a metaphor, you're obviously trying to relate something known to something unknown. So if you could kind of describe for us what a topological metaphor is.
Well, in my thinking, this requires setting it up a bit, Bernard. When I started years and years ago my study of theology, I quickly came to the conclusion that, first of all, theology was getting very short shrift from the so-called scientific and philosophical community, because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of theological language. And if you look at the Christian patristic tradition, and this is particularly true of the Eastern expression of it, if you look at it, one of the things that you are constantly reminded is that the terms, the technical terms or jargon of dogmatic theology is a symbolic language. And I took that in quite the literal mathematical sense, that there are resemblances, very strong ones, palpable ones, between the language of theology in that sense, and the language of mathematics, and even to a certain extent the use of applied mathematics within physics.
Mm-hmm.
So right around 1982, 1983, as I was finishing my master's degree, I had been at the time studying at St. Vladimir's Seminary, Eastern Orthodox Seminary in New York City, with a very well-known, internationally known Orthodox theologian by the name of Father John Meyendorff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was assigned a paper, the class was assigned a paper from him dealing with certain topics in Trinitarian dogmatic theology. And I asked him if I could do my paper on mathematical methods in theology. And he asked me what I meant. So I went to the board and I put there's a famous definition, as you know, within Christian theology of the doctrine of the Incarnation that was formulated at the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in 451.
Mm-hmm.
And what I did was I had reduced the language of that definition, which talks about operations, two natures, one person, and so on. So you have three categories of thought here: person, operations, and then nature. And each one of them, if you stop and think about it, are dealing with different kinds of infinities. So we're already in kind of a quasi-mathematical world. So what I had done is I had taken this definition and reduced it to a kind of mathematical symbolization, which I wrote on the blackboard. And Father Meyendorff's reaction was very telling to me, because he was sitting there watching me do this with this look of, I don't know, it was a mixture of abject horror and at the same time fascination. Anybody that remembers Father John will know the kind of expression that crossed his face as I was doing this. He was quite a character. But anyway, when I got done, he held his hands out in front of his face, with his palms up toward me, and shook his hands back and forth, and he says, No, never talk to me about this again.
That would actually kind of be my reaction.
Well,
I'm not really fun with math.
Yeah, well, he said, go ahead and do your paper, but he said, never talk to me about this again. So, I continued to play with this idea of, at the time, and I still in some cases call this whole attempt of mine to symbolize these types of metaphysical concepts in a workable, formally explicit type of mathematical symbolization, a kind of a formally explicit calculus, if you will. I called it analogical calculus, and I still sometimes refer to it that way. But in doing this, I came across what I've been calling also the topological metaphor of the medium, which is very it's much simpler to diagram, and unfortunately I don't have a way of doing that, but I'll try and give people the basic idea of what's going on, and then show what I think, in my opinion, it manifests in terms of various types of philosophical systems and philosophical explorations of metaphysics. Mm-hmm. And that is, if you start with the idea of nothing, okay? Imagine, in other words, an infinitely extended sea of sameness in all directions. Mm-hmm. And because of this, you cannot qualify it by any sort of attributional language. It is a true and proper nothing. Since there are no distinctions in it, you cannot say anything more about it. Now, interestingly enough, as you know, having been a Benedictine, this type of language is the language that medieval theologians in both the East and the West used not only of God, but here's the kicker: they used it of space. Okay,
right?
In the classic physics sense. And this caused a conundrum, particularly in the medieval West, because if you're using the same type of language, non-attributional, infinitely extended, no differentiation, etc., then this meant, first of all, that you had the problem of you were describing God in the same language that you were describing physical things that natural scientists were involved with. So I thought, well, gee, this is very peculiar. And then let's now do something else. Let's play a mathematical game. Let's define a function, and we'll call it hyperdifferentiation. And by defining this function, we're also going to assume, for the sake of a given in the mathematical sense, that this function allows you to make distinctions within that nothing by any means whatsoever. Okay?
Okay.
Now, once you've done that, then what you've done is you've cleaved the nothing. All right? And now what do you have? Well, you've got three nothings, because in the topological sense of mathematics, you've got one region of nothing, you've got another region of nothing, and then you have the common surface between the two, which is in its own right a third nothing. Okay.
Okay. Well, is this like empty sets or?
Yeah. This that's precisely the symbolism that I use in my books to denote this nothing, and then its three differentiations, which in a common surface in topology is signified by the partial differential symbol, which those who are familiar with mathematics will know what that symbol is. So you end up with three nothings, but what is really interesting here is at the instant that you apply this function to that initial nothing, you end up creating number. All right? And the other thing that you've done is you've added information to the system, but in each case, what you have is a signature of nothing that remains, that hyperset symbol that remains in the description of each of those three entities. So what also is beginning to happen is you have an analogical similarity between these three entities because of the presence of that symbolization. So in other words, you also have the beginnings of a way to describe analogical thought processes themselves, because it's written into this metaphor. Now, let's go for a moment to something else that I began to think about. And you're quite right to notice that this metaphor really underwrites all of my books. In fact, it makes its first appearance in the fourth book that I wrote, which is The Giza Death Star Destroyed.
Right.
That's the first time I openly published a part of my private notes about this, what I've been calling the topological metaphor. So it's underpinned all of my books because, as I've said, people ask me all the time, Bernard, how do you connect dots so well? Well, over the course of experimenting, for the last 30 years in trying to create this analogical calculus, I've learned a lot of very specific things about the way analogies function. This formal system allows you to see the difference between apt and inept analogies.
Yeah.
So I use this very deliberately in constructing my books and laying them out in the particular order that they're laid out in. But anyway, the thing that I began to notice was if you took this system and then applied it to metaphysical texts of any sort, be they Neoplatonism or the Platonists or the Aristotelians, or even, you can apply it to basic Hindu conceptions. You can apply it to the Mayan cosmology. In other words, once you learn how to strip away what a remote viewer would call the analytical overlay and look simply at the concepts and the structures, what happens to pop out of all of this is that the metaphor underlies most of these informally explicit systems of metaphysics, and that to me was a huge revelation. And to kind of summarize yet another thing that I bumped into, you mentioned my co-author, Dr. Scott DeHart, that helped me write our book Transhumanism. Mm-hmm. And again, the metaphor appears there in a hugely big way.
Right.
But we began to get, this is very interesting, we began to get a lot of emails from people that were reading the book asking us questions about it. So we decided to do a kind of Cliff Notes response to some of these email questions. And we put it out in a little book on Lulu called Transhumanism in Dialogue. And one of the questions that we were asked was precisely about this topological metaphor. And in that book, we pointed out something very interesting because I had been continuing to read about this subject. And Bernard, I ran across 3 quotations from 3 of the most famous mathematicians in Western history. And I mean, we would not have the civilization and technology we have today without these 3 mathematicians and what they did. And the first quotation that I ran into and that we put in this little book was from René Descartes. Okay, inventor of Cartesian coordinate system and analytical geometry and linear algebra, and
and all that other stuff that high school students
all that
hate.
Other stuff. Yeah, exactly. And what he said is he noticed that in his reading of the ancient mathematicians, the ancient geometers, he came across evidence of what he thought was a system of analysis which allowed them to solve all sorts of problems which we did not yet know and which he thought had been deliberately suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, whoa.
Yeah, that's very curious.
Yeah, that is a real whopper. And then I ran into Newton saying the same thing that he thought in his reading of the ancient geometers, that he found a system of analysis that, again, he thought had been deliberately suppressed.
Wow.
And the real kicker for me was, one of my favorite fellows, and in fact my favorite fellow in that little trinity of mathematicians, Gottfried Leibniz.
Leibniz, yeah.
Yeah, Gottfried Leibniz was just this mad genius.
Truly mad and truly a genius.
Yeah, truly mad. Writing in just so many areas and writing well. He, along with Newton, invented the integral and differential calculus.
And
still, and Leibniz was Leibniz was an extraordinary man because he appreciated that not only did one have to have the right technique, one had to have the right symbolization of it. So he devoted much of his mathematical study to coming up with apt symbols of what he was talking about.
Huh.
So in other words, in spite of the fact that Newton chronologically beat Leibniz to the punch in the discovery of the calculus, we use Leibniz's notation, and thank goodness that we do, because if you've seen Newton's notation for it, it's just
oh,
awful.
That's why Principia is so difficult. Okay.
Oh, yeah. That's another reason. But anyway, Leibniz came along and said pretty much the same thing that Newton and Descartes had said, that he thought that the ancients had a technique of analysis that had either been lost or deliberately suppressed. But then he went on to say some things that were very, to me, hugely important. He said that it appears that they had, first of all, a calculus, in other words, a formally explicit symbolic algebraic type of system to perform this analysis. And then secondly, he also stated very explicitly that it appeared to him that this calculus had nothing to do with numbers. And thirdly, that they obtained their results by a sort of imitation of calculation. And then finally, this is Leibniz after all that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And finally, he says, it appears to me that this system has been suppressed, that they knew this system and used it to analyze all of their mathematical problems. And I thought, whoa, because what it appeared to me at that point was what all three men may have been talking about is what I've been calling this topological metaphor of the medium, or in some cases, analogical calculus. So, I was kind of dumbfounded, Bernard, because what it kind of indicated to me was they were noticing the same things about ancient texts that I was noticing.
Well, I mean, this is a real mind blower because, one, how do you do mathematical analysis without numbers?
Exactly.
But I guess what I'm trying to imagine here is something like word problems. Train A leaves the station at 6:09 a.m. and that kind of thing. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, Newton mentions this. Newton mentions that, the ancients disguised their analysis by verbiage. So in other words, he was alive to the fact that they had some sort of symbolic system, an algebra of sorts, to deal with these things. But the key here for me is Leibniz, because Leibniz, I think, because he was not only interested in mathematics, but like many people in the early Enlightenment, he was interested in linguistics. The thing that caught my eye when he said that that this was a calculus without numbers and they achieved their results by an imitation of calculating, the first thing I thought of was Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
Because, if you look at Noam Chomsky's transformational generative grammar,
right,
what you have there is precisely a symbolic calculus that is doing formal processes, but they're totally unrelated to numbers, and they're not even really reducible even to a binary type of logic. And if you go back to what we said about the topological metaphor, if you look at it from the standpoint of a formal system of logic, that system is ternary rather than binary.
Right.
So in other words, you're creating a kind of an asymmetrical logic. The closest approximation to it would be the idea of superposition in quantum mechanics and data information processing and so on.
Yeah, where at least some of it doesn't exist at some given moment.
Yes,
that kind of thing.
Well, in superposition, if you notate it in binary notations, a bit of information is both a 1 and a 0.
Right.
At the same time.
Right.
So topologically speaking, what you're talking about there is a common surface. So, all of this is huge. It still kind of boggles my mind. And there are aspects of it, I'll be very blunt and honest here, there are aspects of it I will not and do not talk about because they're very, very dangerous. But it is nevertheless, I think, something that it appears to me that those three mathematicians were quite correct, that there was something going on that we haven't really quite clued into in some of these ancient texts.
Well, I think that's obvious from not only your writing, but of course so many other writers that have analyzed the ancient texts, that all of these things keep pouring out of it that have analogs to today's world, today's science. I think often of the Buddha's metaphor about reality is like sea foam. It bubbles up, it rides on top of the ocean, and it pops and goes back down in, and it's almost identical to quantum foam.
Yes, exactly. You have the idea of in certain theoretical physics conceptions of the universe being a holographic sort of system. Well, again, this is very similar to the Hindu view, and on we could go. I think the key to all of this, Bernard, is what those ancient texts and civilizations often tell us about themselves. They often strongly either suggest or just come right out and tell you that they're legacy civilizations of something much higher. And I think it's time, that we take that very, very seriously.
Well, indeed, and in fact, there seems to be a snowballing effect going on where more and more people are starting to come to this realization that there is some kind of precursor civilization that was global, minimally global.
Right.
Going back to Richard Cassars' essay on triptychs, he's noted the use of these three doors on sacred buildings and sacred architecture all over the world, all through time, different cultures, and appearing and reappearing in different cultures. And to get an idea is like you look at Notre Dame, and you see the large central portal, and then two smaller ones on either side. Right. And that image, I've seen it in Tikal in Guatemala. I've seen it here. Where is it? Just here in West Java, Central Java. This image keeps appearing everywhere, and it ties in with this whole idea of threes, of Trinity. Right. And that's what got me intrigued with this whole topological metaphor, is that the initial division creates three entities, three sets, and how all this ties together. And it's very, very interesting and exciting, but as you say, it boggles the mind.
Yeah, it does. It really does, because once you get very adept at playing with this, then it becomes very clear that this is a very, very powerful and potentially dangerous thing. Because the other thing, this is very crucial for people to understand, if you assume, as I think did the ancients, that this primordial nothing, which undergoes differentiation, is the vehicle of creation itself, then what you're doing when you suggest that there is this signature of nothing remaining in all derivatives, first order all the way down to nth order derivatives, is that what results from this is the physical medium is not only analogical in nature, but number two, it's an information field that is transmutative in nature. In other words, here, in my opinion, lies the formally explicit basis for their ideas about alchemy. Yeah, so there's all sorts of ways this metaphor begins to play on the human imagination, and that's one of them.
Yeah, and that's something that, it's like pondering infinity. After a while, your brain just revolts at it when you get too far into it. But I wanted to ask you, with the initial split here, we've got a nothingness that divides into two nothings. Now, is this the origin also of the opposites, the things that can only be described by relation to their opposite?
Well, to a certain extent, it is. The dialectic of oppositions, the Neoplatonists made careers out of it.
Yeah.
as did St. Augustine of Hippo, for that matter.
Yeah.
The dialectic of oppositions has in fact, that was one of the things I spent most of my academic theological career writing about in one form or another. But yeah, it's definitely present. But there is a twist to this, and it's a very subtle one. Because particularly in the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition, they're very, very careful, and I think once you hear what I'm about to say, you'll see why. They're very, very careful to say, and they do this repeatedly, that this initial nothing, or to use the Neoplatonic expression, the one, is good. In other words, it's the highest good. It's the summum bonum. And I think what they're doing, and the reason they're doing this, is that they understand that even though there may be this kind of formal system behind it, you expose yourself to danger once you begin to overlay it with what a remote viewer would call analytical overlay. When you start ascribing moral categories to it.
Okay.
And if you don't have that initial additional assumption that this initial nothing is good, then you can end up either elevating evil to its own co-equal principle with the good, or you can end up with systems of dualism, or in yet another manifestation of this, you can end up with the idea, as occurs eventually in Plotinus, as a matter of fact, you can end up with the idea that matter, as the uttermost emanation from the one, is, by that very emanation, evil.
Okay.
So in other words, the material world becomes a manifestation of both good and evil. So there's always this mixture. So I think with that qualification, yeah, you could say that the other types of dialectics of opposition that you find in these types of systems, finitude versus infinity,
right,
corporeality versus incorporeality, and so on and so forth. Once you start exploring it that way, with that proviso, then you're fairly safe. Mm-hmm. Although, we have to admit that during the Renaissance, you have this tremendous revival of Hermeticism, and therefore, in my opinion, kind of a revival of interest in the metaphor itself. You have people like Giordano Bruno.
Oh yeah,
stating that this primordial nothing, this primordial Trinity, is that in which all oppositions co-inhere. You have the coincidenta oppositorum. So you get this kind of beginning within the history of Western philosophy at this point, the possibilities of the philosophical explorations, or even political explorations for that matter, of absolute evil. And, that finally bursts out into full force in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So, there are dangers with this. And like I say, some of the dangers I don't even ever talk about.
Well, and that's understandable, because I can probably begin to deduce some of the things you're thinking. But trying to get a handle on this thing, I guess there seems to be, in your comments, in your writings, and those of others, that there's two basic ways to conceive of this topological metaphor, and that is, one is kind of biological, where mm-hmm. when it splits, you have two complete equals right. that are identical in every way, and they'd make two complete wholes. Whereas the other is looking at it as a pie, and every time you slice it, you get a smaller and smaller right. piece of it, so that right. you never really have a whole. And right. and somehow this all seems to tie into various economic systems, right. And physical systems, that one of them is reductive and the other is additive.
Right.
Am I on the right track with that?
Oh, absolutely. You've touched on a huge thing here, because if you look at the metaphor as it stands in and of itself, and again, we have to remember, this is not a binary system; it's a ternary system. Mm-hmm. You not only have two regions, but you've got the common surface between the two, which in itself is yet another infinity. Mm-hmm. that binds the two together. So you've actually got three entities. And the interesting thing is, as you say, once you perceive the metaphor in this fashion and realize that in its formal description, in the formal description of each of these entities, you still have the presence of that initial hyperset. All right.
Yeah.
So again, there's that, and there's the basis of analogy, because you're tracking a common thing between different contexts. All right.
Okay.
The interesting thing that means is that each of these three entities, resulting entities, and any further differentiations you might make within them are always open systems. They're always described in terms of their relationships to the others.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So in terms of physics, this is a huge thing, because physics is catching on to the fact that no system that they can come up with is ever completely isolated.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a coupling mechanism of some sort, howsoever small or non-significant it may be. There's always going to be this phenomenon. And in terms of finance, in terms of economy, it's as you say. If we look at that initial nothing and assign it a value of 1, and then look at the resulting entities after its initial differentiation, what results there is you can look at those entities in two ways. You can look at them as fractions of that 1,
mm-hmm.
or you can look at them as whole numbers in and of themselves. So as you add more information to that system, either you keep dividing up the pie, as you say, and get ever smaller and smaller fractions, or you look at it as an additive system and get ever more and more numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, depending on which way a culture construes the metaphor, their economy is going to reflect a similar type of view. So in other words, the other thing that this metaphor is telling us, in my opinion, is that there is a deep, huge connection between the basic type of physics or cosmology that you have and the type of financial or economic system that you have.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And one of the things that I've really latched onto with this whole idea, and the other thing I was thinking too, does this system, the topological metaphor, necessarily imply kind of a crystalline structure to the universe, a matrix, if you will?
Well, yes, because if you look at it in a certain way, if you diagram what's happening with each successive order of derivatives, you've got your first derivative with that initial differentiation. Let's assume that you then differentiate each of those entities in their turn. So now you've got second order derivatives and so on. And you can repeat this process ad infinitum. Mm-hmm. And as you do, you're constantly adding information to the system. Well, if that's the case, and I forgot what your original question was, as I'm rambling here.
Well, just by dividing these entities again and again, does that imply that the universe itself has a crystalline or matrix structure?
Well, if you're diagramming these derivatives, these orders of derivatives, what you're going to end up with is a huge branching tree diagram. Although it's very important to understand, here we're back to topology again.
Mm-hmm.
This is all taking place n-dimensionally. So in other words, you can't think of this in terms of a two-dimensional cellular structure.
Right.
You have to think of it in a multidimensional way with lateral connections between each of these derivatives, as well as vertical connections between them. So this is a hugely multidimensional thing. But what this is telling us then is that at each branching node in this system, what you in effect are describing is a crystalline structure, and one that, depending on how you do this, how you apply each level of differentiation, it can be either periodic or aperiodic. So yeah, you can have both types of crystals if you want to.
Well, and actually, this seems to me that how do I explain this? Einsteinian relativity implies that mass warps space-time.
Right.
But another way to look at it, using your metaphor, is that space-time warps and creates mass.
Right.
Now, am I onto something there, or just completely nuts?
Oh yeah, I think you are. Let's illustrate it by pointing out a conundrum within quantum mechanics. You have, of course, in the standard model, you have hadrons, leptons, all of these things in the ever multiplying family tree of particles.
Yeah.
But you get, if you look at hadrons, they're supposedly, if you follow Murray Gell-Mann's insight here, they're composed in their turn of quarks, and in the case of protons and neutrons, interestingly enough, 3 quarks each. Okay.
Right. Yeah. I never thought about that one.
Yeah, we're right back to threes again. And interestingly enough, Murray Gell-Mann, when he's describing the charges of quarks, gives them fractional charges. Now who's ever heard of such a thing? What the heck is a fractional charge? Well, this indicates to my mind, the artificiality of quantum mechanics in a certain sense, because what's a proton? Well, it's if I recall correctly, it's 2 up quarks with a fractional charge of 2/3 and 1 down quark with a fractional charge of a -3rd.
-3rd, right?
So you add 2/3 plus 2/3 minus 1/3, and you get 1. So it's got, it has, conveniently enough, it has the charge of 1, and voila, you've got your proton. So, and then, a neutron, well, it's composed of 2 down quarks with a charge of a -3rd plus an up quark with a charge of positive 2/3, which adds up to 0. And you've got a neutron. So you look at these things, and increasingly you come to the realization that what quantum physicists, what particle physicists are playing around with in their big machines are nothing but mathematical descriptions of information. In other words, we're not even really dealing with little tiny billiard balls. We're dealing with packets of information. Well, the problem here is, the conundrum is they're doing all of this in the context of a theory which has yet really to come up with a good explanation of mass.
Right.
And of course, you've got Higgs and the Higgs boson and so forth, which again are popping out as mathematical artifacts of the system. So the real problem is, how do you account for mass? And it would appear that mass is the result rather than the cause of these higher dimensional mathematical descriptions. And let me toss in a third curveball, a third whopper here. And that is, I'm fascinated with the thinking and work of Gabriel Krohn. Yeah, this tremendously brilliant genius electrical engineer that came to this country from Hungary and eventually ended up working most of his life for General Electric in Schenectady, New York. And Krohn, interestingly enough, came up toward the end of his life. He began thinking of the universe in terms of a great big huge crystal. And more interestingly to me is that he realized that all electrical machines of any nature whatsoever were, first of all, networks of simple electrical machines, and that every electrical machine, every specific electrical machine that mankind could construct, were manifestations of a generalized electrical machine, and that you could convert that generalized electrical machine into any particular electrical machine by the process of tensor analysis through tensor calculus. Now, and as the final whopper, what that meant was that every electrical machine was itself a network of hyperdimensional spaces. Because you see, in describing the transformations of one machine into another through tensor calculus, you have to use multidimensional mathematical techniques to do this.
Oh, man.
So, in other words, what pops out, at the end of all of this is you get the idea of any electrical machine, no matter how simple it is a manifestation of hyperdimensional spaces
Wow.
in 3 dimensions. So, yeah, wow, so...
Although, I mean, you just blew my mind. It's way too early for that. But it makes sense because you've got a rotating device inside of a magnet. You're basically creating torsion. That's what it is.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
So, this plays out in so many ways. But I think, given what I've read, I recently acquired in the last few months a couple of books, one by Crone himself, and then another book of papers of people commenting on his work. And it's extremely interesting to me to read these things because it boils down to the fact that this man, toward the end of his life, was thinking precisely along these terms. And I'm willing to bet, just on the basis of intuition, that he was probably thinking along some sort of lines similar to this idea of the topological metaphor of the medium. He had to have been to come up with some of the ideas he was coming up with.
Well, and actually related to that would seem to be Maxwell's quaternions,
yes,
that create basically a cell structure.
Right.
Based on vectors running in all directions around them.
Right.
I mean, this whole thing just all of a sudden starts collapsing into something almost thinkable.
Yeah, it is. And interestingly enough, the other thing that we need to remember here, Bernard, is if you look at the tradition of Kabbalah, you definitely have, within that body of doctrine, you have 2 very interesting things. You've got the idea that the universe is a crystal, and you also have the idea that God created the universe by combinations of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So what's that telling you? If you strip away the analytical overlay, what it's telling you is that every distinct thing that is created by whatever process is really nothing but a combination of information, of sets of information.
Wow.
So again, these ideas are very, very old. I think what's happening is our mathematics is beginning to catch up with them. So as it catches up, gradually the language of philosophical metaphysics, which is analytical overlay, begins to fall away. But you're still dealing, ultimately, like it or not, this is bad news for the atheists in the crowd. You're still dealing with the same system. And, this is the other thing about the metaphor. And again, Dr. DeHart and I pointed this out in yet another one of our books that we co-authored, is if you look at this primordial nothing, there is an inherent dialectic set up right at the outset, if you consider it carefully, because this first differentiation, is it a random act or is it an act of reason?
Yeah.
Because there is no prior reason to this primordial nothing, it's both. So in other words, you can look at this system so to speak, quote unquote, atheistically and say, well, this is an example of a random self-organizing system. Or you can look at it theistically and say, yes, but the whole thing is observer dependent.
Oh, man.
You see, in other words, I tell people all the time, Bernard, that once you understand the implications of this metaphor, it's an acid drip.
Oh, yes.
On all systems of philosophical metaphysics, from everything from Hinduism to modern Western atheistic materialism and what have you, because the metaphor, the dialectic in the metaphor is a both-and dialectic. It's not an either-or dialectic. So fundamentally, it is not a dialectic of oppositions. So,
wow.
It just goes on and on and on.
Well, I guess the alchemist's dream of transhumanism, of rising back up through the hierarchy and achieving the androgyne at the beginning. Basically, they're trying to get back to this primordial nothing. Is that what's happening?
I think it's a little. Yeah, I think in a certain sense, I think that's at least part of the effort. But it's an effort undertaken by, and any language I use here is going to sound presumptuous on my part. But it's an effort being undertaken by people that really don't understand what's going on. Because the other thing about this metaphor is that once information is introduced into the system, there's a certain temporal vector that emerges from it. Hans Reichenbach's old thinking about that on a cosmological scale.
Right.
So it becomes difficult to reverse that vector of time within the overall system. It's not impossible, in my opinion, to reverse the temporal vector in a certain portion of the system. There's a difference. But the other thing here is that I think there are those in the know, so to speak, within people that are thinking about these types of things, that are less interested in reascending back up to that primordial androgyne. We should probably say something about that here in a few minutes. But that group of people, I think, realizes that if they could understand, or if they knew the key that would turn the lock and enable them to manipulate the system at higher order derivative levels, first or second derivative levels of the system, then they would have immense power. And I think that they are looking for that key.
So it's purely a greed thing, then. It's not really
it's
there's
for
not
power.
an ideological reason for it.
Right. Yeah, it's purely for power. And, I like to say, I've said many times when I've talked about this metaphor idea with various people, that if you understand it and if you really grasp the significance of it, then it would allow you, if you grasped it in all of its fullness, it would allow you to take, all of those library shelves full of grimoires and ritual magic and, magical how to do it cookbooks, and just throw them away, because you'd have the key, the formally explicit grammar in the Chomskyan sense, rather than these informally explicit grammars, or grimoires as they're called. You'd have the basis of them, and therefore you wouldn't need them. So I do think that there are people out there seeking this, that know that there's something fundamental that they've been missing.
An error in the calculations, as it were.
An error in the equations, yeah, so to speak. But we mentioned the androgyne. We should probably talk about that.
Yeah.
One of the things that Dr. DeHart and I think maybe we talked about this in our previous interview. I don't remember. It's been so long.
Yeah, it's been a while, yeah.
We ran into something very odd, perplexing in a way to us. And that was, we were not finding the imagery that we hear so often in the New Age circle of the sacred feminine. What we were finding was the image of the sacred androgyne, which more often than not was couched in masculine terms. And again, that presented a conundrum. How do you have a masculine androgyne?
Right.
So what's going on? And we really, I'm not kidding, we were pacing back and forth as we were writing that book, trying to figure out what in the name of sense is going on here. And finally, I forget which one of us it was. I think it was me, but it's hard to remember. Finally, we decided that what was most likely going on here was a process of analogical reasoning, once again. And that if we're dealing with a high civilization, they would have known.
Hello? 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 Are you there?
There we are. We lost.
Yeah, not quite sure what happened there. Just a second. Keep the recording and pause. And pause. Okay, now, where were we?
I remember where we were.
Okay, good.
When we were looking at this androgyne, we eventually came to the conclusion that they were calling it a masculine androgyne because they were using a process of analogical logic that was in turn based on their knowledge, scientific knowledge, that any mammalian male carries both sexes or is the sexual determiner of any offspring.
Yeah, okay.
In a way that the female cannot and does not. Right. So in other words, males by their very nature are, in a certain sense, to their way of thinking, androgynes already, whereas a female isn't. And they simply sort of projected that imagery then to that initial nothing and called it an androgyne and used masculine terms of it because it was producing differentiation. And that's very interesting. I covered this whole topic at great length in a book of mine called Grid of the Gods.
Grid of the Gods, right.
Yeah, where you have the musical cosmology of the ancients. The female is the octave. Of any fundamental note on the keyboard, so to speak, the female would be the octave, and the male would be all the notes in between, because again, it's the masculine that does the differentiating. The female can only be cloned, and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah.
So again, the parallel with modern scientific thinking is rather profound, because geneticists are telling us that the female is the default setting for humanity, and it's the male that's kind of the mutation of it
that
all. Continues
down the path a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
One was curious too, going back to the Buddha. The whole purpose of Buddhism is to achieve nirvana, which is nothing.
Right.
And this seems to all relate to the same concept again and again and again.
Right. Well, we can take that. The fun thing about this topological metaphor is not only does it teach you how to avoid analytical overlay, but it also invites it at one and the same time. Because it's rather like filling in specific values for x and y in algebra. If you look at that initial empty hyperset, that initial nothing, and put the analytical overlay of personhood on it,
Mm-hmm.
because after all, what's a person? Can any of us define our absolute personal uniqueness in a positive way? And the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, we have to use what the ancients and Middle Ages called the via negativa, the negative way.
Right.
Because ultimately, any categories of thought, or any sum total of categories of thought, be they mind, will, memory, emotions, don't sum up to the uniqueness of the individual person. So if you look at that initial nothing in that way, as personhood itself, then
Wow.
yet another interesting thing pops out, because you have the idea that consciousness at some level, be it howsoever rudimentary, or on the other end of the scale, howsoever preternatural or supernatural, or the intelligent bodiless powers, to use yet another expression,
Right.
that the universe is suffused with consciousness. And again, that's a very Eastern view. It's a very Christian view. You've got a description there in a certain sense of the communio sanctorum, the communion of the saints. So in other words, on and on this goes.
Well, and the other impression I'm getting here is because you keep saying, well, it can be this and this, or
right.
This and but and both. It's kind of a Schrodinger's cat kind of deal here, where the cat in the box is both dead and alive until you look at it.
Right. Yes, exactly. The system itself, in other words, it's Schrodinger's cat on a cosmological scale.
Wow.
It's the idea of superposition on a cosmological scale. So yeah, it's a hugely fascinating topic, and you can use it to analyze almost anything once you understand the basic underlying fundamental triadic or ternary structure of it, and realize that it's an analogical structure to boot.
Well, is this where the 3 comes from? It seems like, in numerology, 3 is a number of perfection. In nature, you look at trees and they always branch in 3s, and everywhere you look, a 3 keeps popping up somewhere. And is this where this is coming from?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah,
there is a cause and effect there.
Yeah, I believe very definitely that the ancients were right, that there's a fundamental 3ness inbuilt into the cosmos, and this is why. Because that initial differentiation, by the nature of the case, cannot produce a 2. It cannot produce a binary system, because you've always got that common surface that results from this. And 1, 2, 3, there you go. So,
wow.
It's very interesting to me, because I ran into this very, very early on studying theology, because I believe it was St. Gregory of Nazianzus that said there is no middle step of 2 in the doctrine of the Trinity. It's 1, 3. There's no 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay.
It's almost as if they're saying it's 1, 3, 2.
Yeah.
So you find little clues like this just lying in the most unusual places. Hinduism, the Mayans, Greek church fathers.
Oh, and just things like the third eye and the number 3 just falls out of everything.
Try and think of Western music without triads.
Oh yeah, you can. There's no way. Yeah.
So,
Uh-oh. I lost you again. Hello. 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 Come back.
There we are.
There we are. Okay, we were looking at 3s.
Yep. Well, I don't know where we got cut off there when the call was dropped, but I also made the comment that, try and think of Western music without triads.
Without the triads, yeah.
Yeah, it'd be fundamentally impossible. And again, in my opinion, this is another thing that I've explored in my books is all the way back with the first book, The Giza Death Star, is I think that the modern Western system of musical tempering, the equal system of tempering, actually was probably a known thing to certain ancient secret societies like the Pythagoreans.
Mm-hmm.
Because you see the rise within the West of this system of tempering after the sudden explosion of Hermeticism and Hermetic texts during the Renaissance.
Yeah.
So, this to me is not an accident that this occurs, and then all of a sudden we have, people like Palestrina and Monteverdi and Heinrich Schütz and so on composing this wonderful new sounding music with all of its contrapuntal complexity.
Yeah.
That has the notes that the Beatles use are the same notes that J.S. Bach used, but they're not the same notes that Hildegard of Bingen used. So,
Well, no. In fact, when you listen to Baroque music or the much older stuff, it's almost it's not as pleasing as what we would consider music now.
Well, I think Baroque music is very pleasing. It depends on how you temper it. But if you listen to Baroque era music and then compare it, say, to the music during the High Middle Ages, yes, it is the music of the High Middle Ages won't sound quite as pleasing because of its reliance at that stage in musical history on the natural physical ordering of the harmonic series. What we have to remember, and I tell people, if you're not understanding what I'm talking about, listen to the first lecture of Leonard Bernstein in his 1973 Harvard Norton Poetry Lectures, where he goes through the harmonic series and explains why modern Western music sounds as it does. What they did was they made a mathematical adjustment to the naturally occurring harmonic series, so that you had 12 notes on the keyboard that would allow you to use those 12 notes in any key whatsoever with all of the inbuilt harmonic relationships between fundamentals and so on and so forth without having to stop and retune the instrument.
Right, you're able to transition immediately without an intermediate step, yeah.
Right, and once this is done, then you have this explosion of this very complex, very alchemical, incidentally. I just wrote a book called Thrice Great Hermetica and the Janus Age last year. And part of the book does talk about music, and in particular the music of the Baroque era, and even more particularly the music of the two great Bachs, Johann Sebastian and Carl Philipp Emanuel.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I point out in the book is if you look at the music theory treatises of the 18th century in Germany, they use alchemical terms borrowed directly from alchemy to describe what they're doing in music. Because if you listen to that music, what you have basically are Noam Chomsky's underlying strings that are then endlessly subjected to very specific, formally specifiable procedures of permutations. They turn a motif upside down, they play it backwards, they play it forwards, they speed it up, they slow it down, they chop it apart, recombine it, on and on it goes. So you've got all this going on, and in addition to this, you've got, it's taking place in a multitude of independently moving voices that are making harmonic sense.
Wow.
So you actually have a cosmological, philosophical aesthetic here that's also taking place, in that you have a musical representation of individual entities or persons, if you will, doing their own thing, so to speak, but doing it in a rational way that when combined with others doing it in a rational way makes perfect harmonic sense. You're listening, quite literally, it's the way they thought of it, you're listening to the music of the spheres.
Of the spheres, right. Well, and in effect, aren't you saying that they are engineering the medium through vibration?
Yes.
Sounds to me that's exactly what you're saying.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. It reaches extremely subtle, deliberately calculated depths, in the music of the box.
Oh yeah.
I just did a vid chat for the members of my website last Friday, and we were talking a bit. I always get questions from people about music, and what are some of the codes that J.S. Bach put in his music. So I went and I got my score of his B minor Mass, and then I just pointed out some things that musicologists tend to overlook. The Et Incarnatus from the Creed is written in 3/4 meter. Well, the question is why? Why would this very pious Lutheran be writing that particular piece of music in that time? Is that simply caprice, or was this deliberately calculated? Well, the problem is when you're dealing with composers of that era, chances are it's deliberately calculated.
Huh.
So why 3/4? Well, Trinity and the four Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
And then why is the Et Sepultus Est from the Creed written in 3/2 meter? Well, again, you have second person of the Trinity, and so on and so forth. On and on we could go.
Wow.
And those are just the things that you don't really hear except subconsciously. Then you've got what's actually taking place in the music itself, and this Baroque idea of the doctrine of the affect, because and this is very difficult for the modern to understand, because we have been following this romanticist aesthetic since the 19th century in the West, where the artiste, is the subjective prophet of his own emotions.
Right.
And he's trying or she's trying to communicate his or her personal aesthetic and subjective feelings to the audience. In the Baroque era, it's very different. The affect is an objectified emotion. So in other words, again, you strip away analytical overlay. You're not sitting there listening to a piece of music saying, oh, I feel happy, or I think he's happy, or no, you don't do that. What you do is assign a purely symbolic notation to whatever it is that you're feeling, and that in turn becomes the affect. So the composers at that era were quite literally trying to create formulae that would invoke certain emotional responses, not only in the listener but in the performer and in the composer himself.
Right.
So it's for this reason that music tends to be kind of impenetrable to the modern Western listener, and for many other reasons as well. But all of these things again are coming out of this tremendous explosion of Hermeticism, which in turn, in my opinion, is coming out of this metaphor.
Well, in effect, I want to ask you this, since you are musically inclined. Are these various keys that evoke certain emotions, is this a cultural thing, or is this something actually coming out of the vibration?
It's coming. A modern theorist would say, well, it's just totally random. There's nothing to keys producing certain affects. A Baroque composer, on the contrary, would say, oh, no. The selection of the key itself is part of the conjuration of a particular affect.
Well, you listen to like D minor, and D minor always puts you in kind of a morose mood, or
right.
A is always kind of a bright and happy sort of key.
Happy, right, exactly.
And it seems to be, above and beyond culture, it seems to be something that exists in the vibration itself.
Yes, definitely. they would have said very much the same thing. There are, in other words, there are reasons that Beethoven wrote the Emperor Concerto in the key of E flat. There are reasons that Johann Sebastian Bach wrote two of his most famous toccatas in the key of D minor. There are reasons that Mozart wrote that 21st piano concerto in C minor.
In C minor,
all of these things are very, very definitely a part of the thinking of that period. This period of musical history from the Bachs, Scarlatti, Vivaldi, on up to early Beethoven is suffused with this doctrine. At some point, even as late as Beethoven, you find adumbrations of this doctrine. Wow. Most people, it astounds me. Most people can sit and listen to the first movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony and not realize that during one major portion of it, they're listening to a fugue.
Yeah.
So
just kind of sneaking in the back door.
He sneaks it in there, So,
I mean, and what amazes me is how all this stuff, people would think, well, music can't possibly be related to religion, which can't possibly be related to physics or economics. And yet, once you start looking at this topological metaphor, it all of a sudden, the whole thing just kind of falls together in one big quivering mass.
Well, it's the essence of the metaphor, again, is it's analogical in nature. And that means, if you want to look at it yet another way, it's a mapping function in topology from one context to another. And now let's put analytical overlay over the term context. It's one discipline to another. So in other words, you can detect analogical similarities. This is why Bernstein's lectures are so hugely important, in my opinion, because he approached the whole thing from an analogical point of view, trying to point out not only similarities but discrete and formally specifiable similarities between the functions of natural language and the functions of music, or the rhetorical tropies of natural language and similar structures that appear in music.
I can tell you,
very interdisciplinary.
Sure, and I can tell you from speaking multiple languages, living in a foreign country, one of the hardest things to do is one, when you're teaching someone English, to teach them the tonal range that transfers as much information as the words do. And it's when you're learning another language, you sound flat to other people because you're unable to get the it's almost like a sing-song that underrides like a subcarrier wave, that's underwriting the language and carrying all this information with it. And this is, I guess, pretty much related to what we're on about here.
Yes, absolutely.
Especially with Chomsky, that's definitely part of his deal.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
The unspoken grammar. But I've already kept you much longer than I promised. But I do want to plug your website, gizadeathstar.com, which is fascinating. You do an amazing job of analyzing current events and putting them in context. And you're one of the few writers I know that are consistently predictive in your ability to break down current events and see where they're going. And I don't really mean predictive as in, remote viewing, but predictive as in following the trends to their logical conclusion. But what else are you working on now? I understand you're finishing up a book for the publisher. Where is that going?
Yeah, I have a book right now I'm working on called The Third Way. The subtitle of it is The Nazi International, the European Union, and Corporate Fascism.
Oh, wow.
It's a book that's kind of, if your listeners are familiar with my books, I tend to write my books. They're all intentionally and deliberately designed to dovetail into each other.
Sure.
They're written in kind of a preconceived order, but within within the total series of books, I have kind of sub-series, certain tracks, if you will, that I'm on. And one of them has always been the Nazi period and the Nazi movement. And so this book is kind of designed as yet another book in that smaller sub-series of books. It's definitely one of the more it's going to be one of the more highly speculative and controversial books that I've written.
Well, that's what I love about your writing, though, is I love a little controversy. It makes you think.
Well, there's a lot of controversy in this one.
Well, good. The more the merrier.
Be warned. There's a highly speculative chapter in this. There's one particularly controversial chapter in it, and a lot of information that I knew about way back when I was writing the Nazi International, but which has been 6 years ago now. But I couldn't put this information in that book because at the time I thought, well, this will just be overwhelming if I do. And it's really out of the temporal context if I do. So I waited until now I had to write certain other books before I wrote this one. That's just kind of the bottom line.
Well, and you've said before that your books kind of stand alone, but it sounds like you're kind of getting to the point now where you have to build on past arguments in order to move forward.
Well, yeah. All the books do that. They all build on an overarching big, huge argument, and but they do. Yeah, the books do stand on their own. You can read them in any order. You'll quickly discover that they all kind of plug into each other. But they're all deliberately designed both to stand on their own and yet be plugged into a much larger series.
Well, and I have to tell you that your writing has been absolutely fascinating. It's very much opened my eyes. The first one I ever picked up was Cosmic War, and that just basically turned me on my head. It really, all of a sudden, it made all these myths and legends come alive, and I think that was one of the most valuable things anyone's ever done for me.
Well, thank you.
So I highly recommend people read your books. We have a little group here that we read your stuff and discuss it on rare occasions, but still we get together and pop a few beers and enjoy having our minds blown.
Well, cool. That's
it's a lot of fun, believe me. We get about 3 pages into it, and we're off onto all different topics. So it's very interesting.
That's what I like to hear. I like people to enjoy them and come up with their own ideas and conclusions. They don't have to agree with mine. The more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned in this attempt to try and reconstruct where we've been and where we're going. Just let me add one thing. On my website, there is a bookstore, so all my books are there if you want to order them. And I do get a few extra pennies if they order off of my website. I get a few extra pennies from Amazon, so that's the starving artist's plea there. So.
Well, and perfectly understood, because I'm one of them too. So yeah, we definitely understand that part of it. A few pennies is at least a partial pack of cigarettes. So.
That's right.
That's right. But I do want to thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating as usual. I want to also recommend you, of course, did, I don't know, almost 100 interviews with George Ann Hughes over on thebiteshow.com. I think it's probably more like 50, but there's a lot of interviews there. She passed away, as you know, recently. Just recently, right?
Yeah, her son has kept the website up. As far as I know, he has plans eventually to continue the show and do interviews himself. I need, as a matter of fact, to contact him and find out what's going on. But, just Google my name. People can find interviews not only there, but with you, with Daniel List at Dark Journalist. I've done some interviews with Whitley Strieber. So just Google my name, you'll find my interviews.
You're all over the place. Not in a bad way either. That's actually it's a wonderful thing, because The information you have to put out is valuable. And I don't recommend people, as you say, come at it with a sycophantic sort of attitude. But the brilliant part of your writing is that it shows a different way and opens up whole new lines of inquiry that people can use to figure out their own path.
Right.
And it's very, very fascinating, your work, and well documented, and I really, really enjoy it.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll let you go. I want to get back to bed. It's
okay.
It's quarter to dark 30 up here. So
yeah. Well, let me know when you get the interview up, Bernard, and thank you for having me back on.
Oh, my pleasure indeed. And thank you very much for joining us. And we'll talk soon.
Mm-hmm. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you. If you enjoyed this interview, then you will want to check out Dr. Farrell's more than 24 books and his daily blogs at gizadeathstar.com. And of course, we always welcome your visits and support of Radio Farside and Life on the Farside. You can find us at algenguy.com or on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We have regular updates with news and views with that Indo-Tex flavor. So kick your shoes off and set a spell. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more quality programs in the near future. Sampai jumpa!